Educational Theater Program at the City College of New York proudly presents the 2014 Family Arts Day, Saturday, May 10th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Family Arts Day offers free fun for everyone. There will be theater games, face painting, puppets, sing-alongs, clowns and mask making, live performances, and much more. That's Family Arts Day, Saturday, May 10th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Held at Aaron Davis Hall on the campus of the City College of New York at 135th Street and Convent Avenue. For a full schedule of events and directions, visit www.ccny.org.
Film Festival, the Center, 394 near 165th Street in Manhattan. For information, 917-946-8903, 917-946-8903. The film festival features Al Ghazali, The Trials of Muhammad Ali, Return to Goree, and 8 Centuries of Islam in America. May 3rd through May 4th. Information, 917-946-8903, presented by the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood Communications Department.
WHCR, the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, the New York Academy of Medicine, Emblem Health, Metro Plus, Health First, and City Care invite you and your family to the National Urban Health Conference held April 25th through April 27th. The National Urban Health Conference will feature major presentations on building healthy communities, spiritual health, and an all-day conference on youth health issues. All events of the National Urban Health Conference are free and open to the public, but space is limited. For a full schedule and to register, please call 212-862-7200 or visit www.greaterharlemchamber.com.
The first Islamic Film Festival occurs May 3rd through May 4th at the Malcolm X Betty Shabazz Center, 3940 Broadway near 165th Street in Manhattan. For information, 917-946-8903, 917-946-8903. The film festival features Al Ghazali, The Trials of Muhammad Ali, Return to Goree, and 8 Centuries of Islam in America. May 3rd through May 4th. Information, 917-946-8903, presented by the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood Communications Department. This is WHCR 90.3 on the FM dial, coming to you from the campus of City College in Harlem, USA. The program that you're about to hear, Respect for Life, does not reflect the views, attitudes, whims, deeds, or any other proclivities of the management of WHCR, nor that of the administration of City College. However, the program does reflect the research done by the participants in the program who are live and live in color in studio by phone interview. And of course, there is you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, boys and girls, the first-class citizens of the world. To God belongs the glory, and we thank the Most High for blessing us with another day on this good earth, another day to do some good deeds for ourselves, our families, our communities, and humanity at large, treating everyone the way we would love to be treated, setting the standard, setting an example that can be followed by family and others. Once again, this is Respect for Life. We deal with mental health issues here on Respect for Life, here on WHCR, and we approach it from various angles. And today we'll be looking at the spiritual side of life plus other issues. Our guest in the studio is Rev Michael Wouldren, and he will be with us. say he's with us now, so you say, well, let's get it on. But we got to do this first.
Pain or loss or disappointment. And yet each of us has awakened, arisen, somehow made our ablution, seen other human beings, and said, morning, how are you? Fine, thanks, and you? It's amazing. Wherever that abides in the human being, there is the nobleness of the human spirit. Despite it all, black and white, Asian, Spanish, Native American, pretty, plain, thin, fat, vowed or celibate, we rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom just 'cause I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room? Just like suns and like moons, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just 'cause I laugh. As if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words. You can cut me with your lies. You can kill me with your hatefulness. But just like life, I'll rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh. Does it come as a surprise that I dance? As if I have diamonds at the meeting of my thighs. Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
And once again, WHCR, Sister Maya Angelou, we use that as an introduction to Brother Reverend Michael Wouldren. Thank you for joining us, First Corinthian Baptist Church pastor.
Thanks for having me.
You're after a hard day's work, brother.
Lord have mercy.
I saw the crowd at one of the sermons out there yesterday, brother. It was
a lot.
To be admired, brother.
Yeah, man. We had 3 jam services. We turned people away the last service, and they came and got me panicking. They said, Pastor, the line is
Still
down 115th, turned on 8th. And it was deep. It was unbelievable, man. But it was a beautiful day.
God bless you.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Brother Reverend, we'd like to start with the role of the black church. That's why we used I Rise as an intro. People go to church on Easter and they see other communities go to church, but the church within the black community has a particular role historically, one of healing, my observation. What are your observations? What does your theological studies show?
Yeah, I think the church in the African American community has always played a pivotal role, not just that of agent of healing, but also I think it has also been at the forefront when it comes to issues around social justice, around policy as it affects African Americans, liberation movements, as you think about it, especially when you think about the founding of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was a revolt against the racism that existed in the traditional white churches. I think it's all of those things. I think it has become in many ways historically a combination of social, spiritual, cultural, artistic. I mean, all of that is at the heart of the black church. It has been an incubator for so many movements in this country that without the church in many ways, and not just the church, but I think faith-based institutions within the African American community have always been at the heart of nation and empowerment in our communities. And I think we have to begin to not only reclaim but reimagine what that looks like in the 21st century.
At what point in time did your journey to ministry begin?
Oh man, I'll tell you the exact day, October 29th, 1989. I was a student at Morehouse College. I was a freshman then, and I felt a profound, I think, pull on my life. And I actually thought, Brother Leroy, something was wrong with me. I remember contemplating going to the school psychologist because I couldn't explain what I was feeling. It was a weightiness, it was a heaviness. And then one day on the 29th of October, I really felt an overwhelming sense of a strange feeling. It was one, both joy and angst, both, I think, freedom and kind of confiscation at the same time. And I remember crying on that Sunday morning, and my roommate didn't know what was wrong with me. And for about 20 minutes, I was crying. And after I finished, he said, "Are you okay?" And the first things out of my mouth, I said, "I'm going to be a preacher." No one in my family had been in ministry. No one in my family had that history. But I felt it when I said that Sunday morning, 1989, I felt a weight come off of me. And it didn't mean instant transformation, but it meant that I was now on a different path. And I remember the next day, that Monday, I went to my advisor and I changed my religion from economics to philosophy and religion. And I just stayed committed to that call, man. And when I finished at Morehouse, I went on to Duke University Divinity School. And that's where I did my theological studies.
You, if I'm correct, you tell the story of being a pastor at a church in North Carolina, and that there also was another epiphany, my word, where you make a determination of a particular type of ministry versus, quote, a traditional.
Well, a couple of things happened. One, I started pastoring. I was 25 years old, and I actually told myself, my wife, that I would really just pastor for maybe a year or two. When I went into Duke Divinity School, I wanted to go into ministry, but I also wanted to be a professor. My ultimate dream and goal at the time was to be a college or university president. I think many Morehouse men want to be like Benjamin Elijah Mays in some way to recapture that Morehouse mystique. And so I wanted to be a college president. My wife got into a PhD program at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I had graduated from Duke, and I needed to do something. I was already working at Duke University as a university minister. But then there was this small church in East Durham that needed a pastor. And I agreed to pastor, but in my mind I was going to do it for just maybe a year or so, and then go back and pursue other studies. And about 6 months into it, I realized that this is what I was called to do, to pastor. It was a very, very powerful experience. And there I realized that this was ultimately my vocation, to lead people, to lead communities. And I think it really opened up a new way in my own spirit, because I realized that one of the greatest ways to impact change in our communities is to lead people and to lead communities to see themselves differently. And it was. I couldn't be a traditional pastor in the sense of how we understood the church. I really wanted to be the kind of pastor and lead the kind of church that would have caught my attention when I was about 15 or 16 years old. And so we started doing a lot of non-traditional things at this small church in the Bible Belt in North Carolina. And it was about 25 members when I started there in 1996. And by the time I left, there were about over 600 members there. And the majority were young people between 21 and about 35 at that time, which was strange because a lot of young people didn't really go to church like that. But we had a very young congregation, and I just did things that made I think made church, made religion, made the Bible, I think, easier to access. And I think that awakened something in many people, from the older members to the younger members, about what it meant to be an empowered believer, to really pursue a way of understanding that does not, I think, negate one's intellectual engagement at the same time.
How did the elders in the church relate to the non-traditional approach? Because churches or faith-based institutions tend to have their own comfort zones.
Yeah.
So how did they react to it? How did you handle that?
Yeah, initially there were some who were hesitant because, again, I was only 25, 26 years old at the time. But what they learned is that they knew I was committed to this. They knew I worked hard because I labored hard in that church. And they developed a quick trust in me because I learned something, that one of the ways as a pastor that you become effective is to really demonstrate authentic and genuine love for the people you're called to lead. I tell people it's impossible to lead people that you're afraid to love. And I've never been one who is afraid to love people, because I know in my life love has been the thing that has really brought me back to wholeness and healing in my life. And so I take that love ethos seriously, and I love people. And I think when people see the genuineness and authenticity of your personality, of your character, I believe they start to trust you in different ways. And so I know that they did not believe I would lead them down paths that would destroy who they were, destroy their foundations, but I wanted to help them grow in ways that many times they weren't willing to. I remember years ago when I was in school, I heard an older preacher tell me, well, you know, the education is good, that theology you learn is good, but you can't bring that into the church. It doesn't work. And I never believed that. To me, to say that what I learned in school I could not use to teach in church was to undermine my people and to shortchange their abilities. And I never believed that. I believed that my responsibility as one who pursued theological training was to be a translator of the complex, so that everyone could reach and access and understand. And so here you were in Durham with people, many people who, some of the oldest who had not finished high school, no college at all, and yet they were engaging some deeper theological questions and issues and reading texts that some people thought they couldn't read, but they were doing it. And I believe if you teach people, they will get it. If you teach and empower people, they will get it. And I had a woman there, I never forget her name, Mrs. Jeanette. And she was an elder of the church at the time, and she didn't have a high school diploma, but here she was, you know, with a copy of a book by one of the greatest theologians of history, Paul Tillich, in his book The Courage to Be. Here she was reading Paul Tillich, and she was getting it, and she was understanding it, because I wanted to take the time to help her get it. And so I never believed that you have to disengage the mind to be one committed to God, and I've always taken that path.
A couple of things. Ethos. You said the love ethos. What does that mean?
It's what is foundational to your being, what undergirds your mindset. In many ways, when I say the love ethos, many people believe that for Jesus, his ethos was love. It is what grounded his ministry, what has shaped his life, and what really lended itself to the own transformative work that he engaged with the people in his time. And so for me, it is the ethic, the love ethic, that undergirds me, is believing the capacity to love people back to wholeness. It does not negate, times of tension and I think and challenge, but it says that what keeps you and grounds you as a human being is the understanding that my goal in life, Brother Leroy, is not to be the best Christian. My goal in life is not to be the best pastor. My goal in life is not to be the best preacher. My goal in life is to be the best human being I can be. And somehow for me, I believe being the best human I can be is connected to learning how to love, and the kind of love that transcends the boundaries and limits of my own personal prejudice.
The love of black people, I'm dealing specifically with us as a people, in the condition that we have been conditioned into, can create a lot of lack of self-confidence, and leading to envy and jealousy, which are worms that eat at a love, that eat at your faith in other people. How have you been able to handle that?
I talk about it a lot sometimes in church. The idea, envy and jealousy, I think, as you kind of alluded to, are birthed from a place where you lack belief and contentness with who you are. It is when you look at who you are and who God has shaped you to be, and then look at other people and you envy them. But it says, one, that on some levels you may not be completely satisfied with who you are. Two, you may not trust completely that who you are right now is not the sum total of your being, that there's more to you, there's more in the evolution of your own identity. And so to desire something that may be even beneath you, because think about it, if I let you be the litmus test for my possibility, I might be eclipsing some things in my own life. If you become the ultimate manifestation, what I think it means to be human, and not engaging what I feel or what God is leading me to engage in as a human being. And so sometimes our envy and our jealousy minimizes our possibility, because we're using other people's achievements or other people's character to set the standard for who we can and who we should be.
10 years ago, you come to First Corinthian Baptist Church. They recruit you. They hear about this guy in North Carolina. They bring you north.
Well, it was a strange thing, because honestly, it wasn't that they heard about me. And this is what a lot of people don't know. I came to First Corinthian 10 years ago as the pastor, but I had been in relationship with 1 Corinthians since 1991. I've been preaching in 1 Corinthians since 1991. I did youth revival for 1 Corinthians, did youth revival for about 3-4 years. And then when one of my former roommates at Morehouse became the pastor at 1 Corinthians, because my predecessor at 1 Corinthians was my roommate for 3 semesters at Morehouse, when he became the pastor, then I came up. I remember when he was installed in 1996, I was at the installation at 1 Corinthians for him, and I also presided over the installation luncheon. And every year from 1996, I was coming to preach until he left. And so I've had a relationship with 1 Corinthians since 1991. One as youth preacher for revival, then guest preacher, and then really friend of the church, and then pastor in 2004. So it wasn't brand new.
So in essence, or in reality, you had tested out the blueprint that you had developed in North Carolina all during that period of time. Then you went into full implementation.
Yeah, I would think so. I think coming here afforded me an opportunity. I came, and I tell people I can speak about it now. I couldn't speak about this 10 years ago, especially around people who love me. When I came to 1 Corinthians, my wife and I went to North Carolina. She was a principal. By this time, the church had grown. I was also a university minister at Duke University. We were doing well. And 1 Corinthians was kind of struggling at the time. In order for me to come to 1 Corinthians, Brother Leroy, I took a $50,000 cut in salary because I believed in the possibilities of the church. It was a beautiful building. It was falling apart. And it was at a prime location, 116th and 7th. I started studying churches in Harlem, and I realized that there weren't a lot of churches with memberships over 1,000, but yet you had 500,000 people in that area, which meant that people weren't, going to church. And so I believe that if we come there with what I had learned in North Carolina and bring that to New York, we would create a movement in many ways. I don't talk about building churches. I talk about building movements. Movements where people can begin to discover and rediscover faith in a way that liberates them and doesn't bind them. Because I knew growing up as a child, I thought church was so restricting and so and held me captive in many ways and did not push me and inspire me to be my best. I wanted to lead that kind of congregation. So when I came here, my wife left the school. She was the youngest principal in Durham. We came up here with our 2 children, and we went to work, 14 years ago.
Okay, so what are some of those elements in the blueprint that has energized the congregation into the vibrant being that it is? What are some of those elements?
Yes, I think one is teaching, because the one way you change a congregation, change people, is through teaching. Knowledge is power, empowering people to really grab hold and participate in their own transformation in ways that yield, I think, tremendous fruit. So it's teaching, and not the Sunday school teaching, not the Bible lessons, but engaging in deep theological issues and questions that really connected to people's living. Sometimes in church, I remember years ago hearing old preachers say that sometimes we're so heavenly minded with no earthly good, right? So bringing the issues that people deal with every day to bear to one's theology and one's religious, undergirdings. So I think teaching that is relevant and transformative. Preaching that is not preaching at people, but preaching with people and dealing with the issues that touch people's lives. It does no good for people to talk about David or to talk about Elijah or to talk about characters in the Bible if you do not become relational in how you engage these ideas and these theories that are in Scripture. So teaching, preaching that is relational, that makes sense, that speaks to the issues. So you speak about abuse, you speak about mental illness, you speak about these issues from the pulpit, which in many of our contexts we don't really talk about. We talk about Scripture, we talk about this verses, but we don't talk about living. So we don't talk about people trying to get over the trauma of being unloved, but we talk about that at this church. We talk about the real heart issues. And I take kind of a psychoanalytic approach to preaching. I try to get into the minds of the characters I preach about and try to draw a picture which the people who are listening can find themselves in that sermon and find a way to engage it. So I think teaching that liberates, preaching that empowers, and then you create programs. In many of our churches, we base ministries on what has always been the norm. Women's ministry, you got the men's ministry, you got the youth ministry, and all these kind of things. But to me, I think you develop ministries out of necessity by making an analysis of the congregation. That speak to who's in that congregation. It's ministries that speak to the needs of the people in that congregation. And so if there are people hungry, we have one of the largest food pantries in the city. We feed over 20,000 families a year. And that becomes relevant. We do things every week with regard to engaging community and empowering the community. So I think when you help people see that church cannot just be this kind of exclusive space, that if we're going to be authentic and true to what our calling is, we then have to be involved in the community. So teaching, preaching, and then community community empowerment, which does not keep a church as a leech in the community, because I think many churches can become a leech, where you're there and you're sucking the life of the community, but you're not giving back. So helping people understand the notion of community. And then I think one of the other pieces is creating an environment where people feel comfortable. So like now you see me here, Brother Leroy, I got this shirt and the blazer on and jeans, and this is how I preach. You know, I preach the same way. I preach in these jeans, I preach in this blazer and jacket, and it lets people know something. That one, and now let me back up. Let me tell you where that comes from. My family is West Indian. I'm the first American born in my family. Both my parents are from Barbados, and my grandmother was the matriarch of this house. And on Sundays, you did nothing. Sundays was church, no outside for me, no playing. You couldn't even watch TV. And so it was deep, man. I mean, Sunday was like the most painful day coming up as a child. And I remember being mad one day, my grandmother. I said, I don't want to go to church. I want to go outside. My friends outside playing. And she said to me, well, why don't you invite your friends to church? I had to be about 9. And I remember going outside. I didn't quite know. I was kind of embarrassed a little bit. But I went and asked my friends. There was about 3 of them who were outside. I said, did you all want to come with me to church? And I never forget what they said to a person. They said, we don't have church clothes. That stuck with me from 9 years old to the time I started pastoring at 25. I never wanted somebody to feel that they could not have an encounter with God because they didn't have the proper attire. They didn't have church clothes. And so for me, it's creating an environment where people walk in and don't feel shunned or looked upon funny because they don't have church clothes. And it doesn't mean that you can wear whatever you want, but certainly there's no premium being placed if you don't come in a suit and a full dress and the best outfit you got. No, I think we always say God says come as you are. We say that and then we put restrictions in a way. And I do think there's some restrictions to a degree, but I want people to feel comfortable. So I think that non-traditional atmosphere, I remove the traditional pulpit desk that you preach from, and I put a high table and a high chair. So sometimes I'm preaching, I'm sitting, and then I'll get up and walk around. It creates a different environment. So what it says is not that I'm preaching at you, but I'm engaged in a conversation with you. And that conversation becomes personal. So I cannot tell you how many times every Sunday somebody will come up to me and say, well, Pastor, I thought you were just talking to me. And in many ways I was. Because that psychoanalytic model says, listen, the only way you could reach people is to go deep within yourself. And I remember one of my mentors said that when you go deep within yourself, you're bound to come out with somebody else. That you'll find what is common to all of us, what connects all of us. Why? Because no matter who you are, black, white, even whether you're Christian, Muslim, it doesn't matter. We all hurt. We all cry. We all laugh. We know what it is to be sorrowful. We know what it is to mourn. We know what it is to rejoice. You speak to the existential issues that shape human beings, and everyone can gravitate towards those messages.
Going deep within oneself.
Yes.
Give an example. How does one do that?
Yeah. Well, one, I think it starts with this kind of necessary transparency and vulnerability and honesty. It is me, for example. I know what it is to grow up in a house where there were heavy expectations by, a father who was a strong disciplinarian. And in those environments, sometimes for me in particular, you had a lot of expectations academically. You were supposed to achieve, right? But there wasn't a lot of nurturing that came. There wasn't a lot of love that came. And what that births in many people is a desire to look for spaces of affirmation. You begin to minimize your achievement and accomplishment, and you want to be affirmed. That need for affirmation oftentimes sends us on paths and a journey that can be destructive and dysfunctional, because if we don't always recognize how even the spaces we look for affirmation can be destructive to our being. And so how do you relate that to scripture? Well, here's a good scriptural story. One of the most famous characters in the Bible is David, right? And we know about David and Goliath and how that David was able to slay the giant. But before that, the scripture says that one of the prophets, Samuel, was sent by God to look for the next king. And he goes to the house of this Bethlehemite named Jesse. He goes to Jesse's house and he says, I want to see your sons, because he's told that the king of Israel would be in Jesse's house. And so Jesse sends all of his sons. In fact, when Jesse sent the first son to Samuel, Samuel thought that this was the king. And God told Samuel, don't look with your eyes, because I don't look like men look. I search the heart, and that's what I'm looking at. And so Jesse sent all of his sons. God said no to all of his sons, and apparently there were no more sons. And so the prophet Samuel asked Jesse, do you have any more children? Do you have any more sons? He said, yes, I got one. He's in the back with the sheep. And then David comes in smelly, the young one that nobody really paid attention to. And he comes in, and when he comes in, this is the one that God said would be king. So the deeper issue is this. You have a father who for whatever reason affirms his other sons but doesn't pay attention to that one son who he's minimized to being a sheep keeper, right? So what does it look like now when you find this son who apparently is affirmed by God and affirmed by this prophet but not affirmed by dad? No matter how many people affirm you, you're always looking for the source, you believe, of your identity to affirm you. And in many ways, David becomes a model of many of us who are great, who have gifts, who are powerful human beings. But at the end of the day, the people they love the most don't affirm them the best.
Overlooked by Father, affirmed by God.
There you go.
And the greatness in David begins to come out.
Yes.
And that can be compared to black people overlooked.
Oh man, overlooked, yes. And the abilities and the gifts often overlooked in who we are. It births something else if you're not careful. Not only the quest for affirmation, but you engage in self-loathing. You begin to hate oneself.
Yes.
Because you don't feel you're good enough. You don't belong. And we know that for sure in our community. People don't feel good enough, don't feel that they belong. And so you find yourselves trying to compensate for what you lack, that lack of love, that lack of affirmation. And sometimes for some of our folk, especially some of our young people, it sets us down paths that can be very problematic when we're looking for community, looking for affirmation, looking for love.
This is WHCR 90.3 on the FM dial, coming to you from the campus of City College. The only place where you hear this kind of great conversation is on this show. It could be on others, but it's up to them to approach it the same way. This show is even listened to by young people avidly when we are on.
You're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
And we'll be getting to your calls, not right now, but in about 5 minutes. And when you look at the ministries in the church, you talked about leadership. The leadership aspect is developed within those ministries, and individuals step forth. For example, I observed some of the things in your church. There was a talent show a few weeks ago, well produced, well orchestrated, and that showed leadership to me. It also showed preparation on the part of the individuals in there. So I can look at that and say, hey, here are individuals having the opportunity to demonstrate abilities, etc., that they may not be able to demonstrate, quote, downtown in their job, but they're doing it uptown. That's one thing. The other thing is mental health, the psychoanalytical approach, where individuals, as a result of coming into the environment, begin to heal mentally and demonstrate some of the greatness that's been hidden in them.
I think I tell people at 1 Corinthians that I believe we're called to be at the heart of this community spiritually, artistically, and culturally. When we did renovations at the church, we really recaptured the theater aspect of the building. It used to be a theater. It was built actually as one of the first palatial movie houses in New York City in 1913, and then it was used as a theater. And so I wanted to bring that uptown. I wanted to bring the arts uptown in a way that was not cost prohibitive. So we've partnered with different entities, whether it was a Jazzmobile or Jazz at Lincoln Center. We've had plays, Dance Theater of Harlem. In fact, when they did their first debut after being kind of off scene for a few years, they debuted at 1 Corinthians. And last winter, they did the Nutcracker at 1 Corinthians. So at prices that were manageable, $15, $10 for people, because I wanted people uptown to be able to have that experience of theater. And so I think the event you referred to that we did was not just really a talent show, although it was called a night of empowerment. We had people from in the community in the area who began to share with the people who came how they got where they were. What were the things that motivated them. So we had from a young man who was an actor at 11 years old, you know what I'm saying, to a good friend of mine who I'm sure you know, Brother Jamal Joseph, Shola Lynch, who directed, produced the Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. So, and they all shared their stories of how they came to be. And to me, we called it a night of empowerment, and we call those persons empowerment catalysts, because sometimes hearing the stories of others and their path to success is inspirational, and it pushes us, and it makes it real in many ways. So I think when we do that, and we have many moments like that in the church where we take people from within the community who've achieved great things and then bring it down to the ground and say, look, this is what happened for me, and this is the path I took, and and it was difficult, it was challenging, but I was able to, be accomplished and be successful. The other side that you mentioned is mental illness. One of the things I realize in our community, and I know you know, is that there's a stigma around mental health issues. We don't necessarily want to address it the way I think we should. And I my own theory is that part of the problem is that we have normalized trauma in our communities. The normalization of trauma in our communities, I think, is one of the most detrimental things that take place. That so much of the trauma and the mental health issues are so woven into the fabric of the community, we no longer see it as problematic. And so we bypass it every day. We see people in the corner. You may see a brother, John, who in the corner, you see him every morning, and John talks to himself, and he's such a part of the community. It's just John, that you never realize that John, there's some issues going on, and who's going to reach out to John, and who's going to minister to John, who's going to speak to John, who's going to get John the help. But we've normalized it. Just how we normalize some other behaviors.
We become numb to it.
We become desensitized to it, and in many ways that becomes just as harmful. And so when you have children,
the one who looks at it and is numb to it,
yes,
becomes harmful to them.
More harmful.
Takes away their sensitivity.
There you go. And you lose a little bit of your humanity when that happens, I believe.
Within your own family, within your own dealings.
Yes, sir. If you think about this, something is that we take as normal is problematic. If I'm a parent of a child, and I must tell my child, these are the streets you need to avoid so you don't get caught up in any trouble in the community, that's traumatizing to a child. We don't think about it that way. But if I now associate location with trouble, fear, panic, injury, that is traumatic to a 9 or 10-year-old. And we don't think about that. We say, well, that's just growing up in the hood. That's what it means growing up in this area. But that is traumatic, and it's so normal in our conversations that we don't realize how dangerous it is to our young people. And then again, that's one example. But you take many of you take when we had the big issue here, and I know our church is really heavily involved. It was stop and frisk. That you don't understand how traumatizing that is, and many people don't realize how traumatizing it is when you criminalize normal behavior. You criminalize walking down the street. You criminalize standing on the corner. And I'm not saying that there are not moments when things happen, but you can't criminalize behavior because it makes the individual feel that there are no spaces where they can be whole and genuine without fear of being persecuted or viewed differently or ostracized or marginalized or castigated. And so we have to be mindful of those kind of things. And it happens in African American communities every day. The traumatic experiences, the generational trauma, all that exists. And that's why I think when I hear people talk about, well, we need to get better schools. Well, if you're going to have better schools, you need to bring a lot of people to the table, not just educators. You need to bring mental health practitioners to the table because many of our young people are dealing with those issues.
Moving to one of the activities that you're currently involved in, that is running for office, the congressional seat in what is now the 13th congressional district.
Yeah.
And they changed the name. They changed the number from 15 to 13.
Yeah. Before that, it was something else. And before that,
they gerrymandered. Yeah. They called it redistricting. They gerrymandered it all the way into areas unknown. I went to a politician's office a few weeks ago. They didn't even know what the district was.
Yeah, a lot of people don't.
They did not know.
Yeah.
And what are you seeing 10 years ago, and what are you seeing now that prompts you on the particular road that you're on now?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has become frustrating to me as a leader in this community is the level of disengagement of the constituents of this district. I tell people this district has over 717,000 people, and yet when you look at the last congressional primary in 2012, about 43,000 people voted. That's just under 6%. 6% of the people of this district make the decision in terms of who goes into Congress for this district. That 6% of the people vote to put someone to be a representative as a lawmaker in this nation. And to me, that's tragic. That when you think about our communities and you think about the critical role that our elected officials play, when you see people who feel disconnected from the process, there's something wrong. Now, I know people say, well, there's just apathy, but I always tell people that apathy is not an originating emotion. It is a reaction to something. And people react, I think, to feeling that their voice doesn't matter, that their vote doesn't really count, and they're not people who really are concerned with their everyday struggles, that they're persons who who want titles but don't want to really lead communities for change. And so I've seen that frustration over the years as a pastor. I've seen people's inabilities connect the dots politically to figure out how things get done and to figure out how their vote actually gets it done. People voting really holds elected officials accountable. If we don't vote, there's no accountability, and then we find leaders who make decisions that are not for the best interests of the community. Elected officials are called to be public servants. That means that they are representing and making decisions for the public interest, not self-interest. I think we've seen a lot of that in not only this district, but in this country, but in particular in our communities. We've seen a lot of self-interest. We've seen a lot of spaces where politics has been put over people, and campaigns take precedence over community. And in the process, the people lose out. And so for me as a pastor, I view what I do already as being a public servant. And to me, this is expanding what that looks like. I hear people say, well, you know, politics is dirty and it's corrupt. And it is all those things, I believe. But at some point, the only way it is going to change is by people of strong conviction and people who are committed to empowering communities to get involved and help reimagine this space. Everywhere I've gone as a pastor, as a leader, I've been involved in reimagining spaces, whether it was in North Carolina and here in this church. Reimagine. I think, for example, we often call ourselves at the church a ever-evolving community of visionaries and dreamers. I think when you begin to dream and cast vision, you're reimagining what is. It is this kind of, discontent, this holy discontent with status quo. And you begin to see, how do we look at this space that heretofore may have been problematic, may have been restricting? How do we now look at this space as being a space that can be liberating and transformative?
As an opportunity.
That challenge.
As a different energy.
There you go. Reshifting that energy.
Yeah.
When you look at, I think of scripture for a second. Everyone talks about the Apostle Paul, who used to be a persecutor of the church. He was zealous to get Christians in jail and see Christians dead. And it's amazing, when he had his own conversion experience, God never took away that zeal. He just rechanneled it. He never took away that energy. He rechanneled it.
You be teaching, brother. You be teaching. Folks who are listening, my own personal experience, you need to go to a service. I call it a service.
That's what it is.
On Tuesday nights.
Yeah.
And that's 7 o'clock?
7 o'clock on Tuesday night. It's called Tuesday Night Teaching.
Tuesday Night Teaching, and it's surreal. I came in there, I was looking for one thing. I said, whoa, this is serious. And you talk about people being engaged.
Yeah, man.
People being engaged. You don't come to church for no Bible study, and the church is full.
Yeah, man.
The church is full.
Yeah, we have a large turnout for. But when I first started pastoring in 1 Corinthians 10 years ago, and I would walk through the community and meet people, I never invited people to Sunday service. I invited people to Tuesday because I thought that was where you really learn what the church is about.
The information.
There you go.
Information.
There you go.
Our people suffer for a lack of knowledge.
We got to teach.
You bring that information, out of that information comes knowledge. But not only that, you the way you present gets them to go home and do some research.
That's right.
And they come back ready.
They come back ready, man. They want to see, man. The teacher gave an assignment. We want to see what the deal is. But that's different too in many of our churches, because I grew up in the church where, quote-unquote, traditional Bible study, there was no questions being asked. The Bible study became, in many of our churches, like another mini sermon. But there was no engagement. There was no teaching. And so that's why we haven't called it Bible study since I've been there. We call it Tuesday Night Teaching. Because some nights we may use scripture. Some nights we may use a book that we're using for a few weeks. And some nights we may just begin with a question to awaken people's minds, and we think through and wrestle through the question. And to me, that's what being a teacher is about. I take that role seriously. I tell people, if you have there are 168 hours in a week, so to speak. I think if you take a 7-day week, 24 hours a day, if you take that, I preach 3 times on a Sunday. The total time for those sermons together maybe 90 minutes. 90 minutes out of a 168-hour day. That means one of the smallest things, the amount of my time that I do as a pastor, is preaching. The rest is leading people, it is counseling people, and then it is teaching. I teach more during the week than I preach on Sunday. That is where you really begin to change lives.
Telephone number 212-650-6903, 212-650-6903. You'll be on the air with Rev Michael Wouldren. He is the pastor of 1 Corinthians Baptist Church, located on 116th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, cross section of St. Nicholas Avenue, and right across from Make My Cake. If you've been buying, getting your birthday cakes, Mother's Day cakes, etc., and you look right across the street. There's a church with a scaffold around it, and if you go there on Fridays, you will see a line of folks waiting for the pantry, and if you're there on Monday morning, you'll see breakfast before.
Yeah,
what do you call that?
Breakfast before books. Yeah, yeah. We have an average of about 200 this morning. About 225 young people who stop by the church on the way to school to get breakfast.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And as we wait for those who might want to join in the conversation, 212-650-6903, the power of prayer. What have you seen in your experience? What have you heard in your experience of the power of prayer?
Yeah, I think prayer is a critical component to who we are as believers. And my teaching on prayer has, I think, many dimensions. One, there is this idea of sacred communication with God. It is that moment of solitude where we kind of find ourselves still and at peace and at ease with God. And I remember many years ago, a famous theologian who was a Morehouse graduate, Howard Thurman, said that prayer is when the deep within God connects to the deep within you. And it is deep calling unto deep. And it is that moment, I think, of ultimate exposure before God, where our souls and our spirits are open before God, and there's this conversation that takes place. Sometimes there are no words being uttered. It is experiencing God in the stillness of the moment. And it is no formality. It is no right words. There's no right way. It is leaving one's spirit open to the presence of God. And what that means to me is that prayer can happen all the time. Because if your spirit is always open to God, to me, that's communication. You could be walking down the street and in communication with God with no words being spoken. It is being attentive and astute to the space you're in. I think that's one avenue of prayer. I think that is the part of prayer that we don't often hear talked about in church. We'll have these kind of prayer meetings and people will come together and everybody will say a prayer out loud, and to me that is prayer as well, but it is a deeper understanding to me of that deep calling of the deep. It is the Spirit of God reaching into the spirit of that which God has created, and there's a sacred and unique conversation that takes place. There's another idea of prayer that you get from Scripture, because you get this idea where the disciples were with Jesus and paying attention to him, and in some way, for some reason, they believed that part of the key to his own strength and ability was in his prayer. And so they come to Jesus one day and they say, teach us how to pray. And so when Jesus teaches them how to pray, what you realize and what you notice from the very outset is that in Jesus's model of prayer, there's no individualism. He does not begin with I or what I want. Jesus's prayer is communal. It is about our Father. Give us this day. Lead us not into temptation. So you don't get a kind of individualistic sense in the prayer that Jesus gives as a model. You get a prayer that is about community. It is about understanding and accessing God. It is about understanding that you cannot have deeper access to God if you do not forgive your brother or sister. It is about how the community rises as a whole and not individuals. And we lose that sometimes because we become so self-centered in our prayer and so intoxicated with ourselves that we miss the idea as Jesus gives it, that prayer is a communal effort. It's a communal venture, and it's about putting the community in contact with a God who keeps us and binds us in love in community.
Prayer warriors.
Yeah.
A commonality with, quote, old-time religion churches. 1 Corinthians, do they have prayer warriors?
Oh, yeah. There's some folk. We got some folk in there who pray, who lift people up, who intercede. There's a notion I tell people that sometimes we forget about intercessory prayer. It is that idea of interceding on behalf of the community, standing in the gap for people in the community who cannot really stand for themselves. And there are saints in the church. You call them seasoned saints, man. And not just seasoned saints. There are people in the church who believe in God and trust God enough, who find themselves standing in the gap for other people. And so, yeah, we do have those mighty prayer warriors in the church who lift up prayers on behalf of the people and on behalf of the congregation. And they play that role as intercessor.
I've had interviews with a medical doctor. He's out in Texas, and Baylor University, I believe, my recollection. And he talks about the miracles that he has seen as a medical doctor, not believing, moving away from his church background, Baptist, and then seeing certain miracles occur. Without getting into them, what may you have seen?
Well, I think
or heard.
Well, I've read some of the articles written in some of the by MDs, doctors who've talked about the power, the healing power of prayer. And there's only been, I would say, within the last 5 to 7 years, you've seen more of it, because there was a time when, they would shun that.
More of those studies.
More of those studies now within the past 5-7 years to show the role of prayer. And when you hear doctors talk about it, they talk about the sense of calm and peace it brings to people. We forget that our bodies are not just physical manifestations, but they're physical manifestations of our internal disposition and our emotional disposition. It's a scripture. So as a person thinks, that is what they are. And sometimes prayer has a way, especially for people who are battling illness and conditions, to bring a positive energy into their life, into their body, that manifests itself physically in many ways. I can recall, I remember for myself personally, in 2012, I got an infection that just went crazy. It started in my leg, and next you know, it was in my blood. It was a MRSA staph infection. Then I was in North Carolina because I was down there visiting to speak, and I got sick. And I remember the doctors coming to tell me that if the medication they gave me did not work, there was nothing else they could do. And they explained to me that it could be a matter of days before I would pass away, because the bacteria was now in my blood system. And I remember after them tears came out a little bit, I remember going into the bathroom. I washed my face, and I stood there, and I just said, God, if this is it, I said, if this is it, and I don't believe this is it, I said, if this is it, I said, I want to thank you, because it has been a great run. I've seen my kids get old. I said, my son is in college. My daughter's going to college. I said, you've blessed me to do great things. And all I want now is a peace to move forward. I didn't say heal me. I didn't say deliver me. I didn't say take this away. I said just give me peace. I walked out of that bathroom, and I just felt good. I felt good. Even though I had bad news, and even though I heard something that might have meant my death, I laid back in that bed, and there was a calm over my mind, my spirit. About 4 days later, they said it was clearing up. Now, there are people who say, well, that's a miracle, and God stepped in. But I also believe that, but it was a conversation I had with God, and it brought a peace to my spirit. And people who are going through chemotherapy and radiation, and people who've been diagnosed with terminal diseases. And I've seen where prayer has brought a calm and a peace in their spirit that has shifted their physical issues in many ways.
Especially if we visit them at bedside and say a prayer with them.
That's right.
Caller, you're on the air. Thank you for your call.
Yes, good morning, sir. I want to thank both you and the Reverend for a powerful conversation. It's good to see you young people doing these kind of powerful things. My question to the very young and the very smooth-looking Reverend is, he's running for Congress. What is your economic thing? I think you need an economic warrior. What's going to be your economic game plan to help our people get a part of the economic pie?
Yeah, I think that there are many ways that you talk about economic development in our community. The tragedy is that it no matter how you look at it, it calls for a tremendous amount of work on many levels. When you talk about, for example, home ownership is big, right? And people don't see that as a manifestation of economic development. But here's what you got to remember. What is owned cannot be gentrified, right? So we hear this big conversation about gentrification, and the way you balance that and you counter that is to talk about home ownership, and you talk about people developing economic strategies around home ownership and around ownership. That's one level. That's a personal level. I think also you have to think of now, how do you partner what I call cross-sector collaborations, because economic development, economic empowerment in our communities also speaks to opportunity and access to opportunities. So you have to begin to realign and reimagine how education looks to prepare people for the jobs of the future. Many of the jobs that are really prepared now for this time in the future are not really shaped in schools. So if you want to create spaces where young people can access and have access to their own economic power, they have to be prepared in ways and trained in ways that gets them ready for the jobs of the future. For example, you have in Brooklyn P-Tech, and in Chicago a school called Sarah P. Good that does a cross-sector collaboration. You have an IBM that partners with the school district and creates a curriculum that not only empowers the young people but prepares them for jobs. It's a 6-year high school, so they graduate with a high school degree and a 2 years associate degree. And IBM, for example, guarantees them that when they finish the program in 6 years, they will get a job. Here's a 20-year-old with a job a minimum of $40,000. Minimum. That's the minimum. And that leads now into helping the young person reimagine possibilities at 20 years old with a job, and they've seen the benefits, and that makes them strong contributors to the economy of the country. I think also, of course, when you talk about developing economic development in our community, is the creation of jobs. Again, those cross-sector collaborative efforts create new jobs. And I think something else that we don't want to talk about creates new jobs, and it's not just about small business, but it's also about immigration. People say, well, how does immigration connect to economic development and immigration reform? I'm giving an example. In New York City, for example, 82% of the small businesses are owned by immigrants. That means then that there are persons who are coming to communities who are creating jobs, who are creating opportunities. Not only that, in 2012, a study by the Kauffman Foundation said that in 2012 alone, U.S. businesses started by immigrants created 560,000 jobs in 2012 and pumped $63 billion into the economy. If you don't have immigrants, for example, you don't have Google, you don't have Nextel, you don't have all these companies that were founded by immigrants that created jobs. And then we have to begin to take seriously our idea of what it means to be entrepreneurs as well, and not always looking to work. Here at First Corinthian, we built the Dream Center 2 years ago, which is 3 blocks north of the church, focuses on 3 areas: arts, leadership development, and entrepreneur development, where we partner with businesses in the community to help young people begin to, here's that word again, reimagine their possibilities to not just work, but also to be entrepreneurs and owners. And then there's another idea, what they call worker cooperatives, where the workers all invest in the business, for example. So you have worker cooperatives where all the employees are owners of the building.
We got 2 minutes.
Owners of the property. So I think those are some very tangible, basic ways that we talk about economic empowerment, economic development, entrepreneurship, the creation of jobs through creative cross-sector collaborations in our community, and education is always the key, and reimagine the educational process.
This is only a introductory conversation with you because it's so broad. As we conclude, 2 areas: your message to youth, young brothers and sisters out there who, quote, feel disenfranchised, not from the vote, but from life, and what your ministry means to those brothers in that Triangle Park who are basically alcoholics, etc., but have greatness in them. Those 2.
I think you could speak about it the same way. At 14 years old, I was labeled an at-risk youth. And I had someone who believed in me. I was put in a program called Operation Alternative. And I had a mentor who believed in me. No matter how reckless I was and no matter how crazy I acted, he always believed in me. He believed in me in the way that he spoke life into me. And I think a lot of our young people have succumbed to this idea that who they are right now is all they ever will be, and they stop dreaming and believing in what is possible again. And I would tell young people, do not accept the ceilings that have been placed above you. Do not accept the negativity that has been spoken into you, that in many ways you have to rebel against those mechanisms that try to undermine the inherent dignity of your humanity and who you are. And I think that's powerful. Young people have to know that they are born with value. They don't have to seek it. They're born with greatness. They don't have to try to go after it. It is inherent to who they are as human beings, and never minimize themselves, reduce themselves to other people's designs and expectations of them that minimize their greatness. That you speak that greatness, that they're born with it, they understand it. And the same thing for my brothers and sisters who may be out in that Triangle Park, that where they are right now may be a reaction. In many ways, it is mental health and how they've accepted certain abuses or accepted certain traumas, because when people seek to kind of drink things away, drink the pain away, or even surrender to substance abuse to get rid of the pain, the idea is going to the deeper issue, the pain that gave birth to the behavior that becomes dysfunctional and problematic. But even in dysfunctional behavior and the problematized behavior, it doesn't define them completely. There's still more to their story. I say that to them all the time. I speak it every week. There is more to who we are, and we got to find it.
Love that. My brother, thank you very much for joining us here at WHCR. And for our audience, go to 116th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, that's 7th Avenue, and you'll have the opportunity to interact with Reverend Michael Wouldren, who is the pastor there and also running for the congressional seat in the 13th Congressional District. May God continue to bless each and every one of you. Remember, get the Amsterdam News in your home, get the Final Call News in your home, get the understanding. God bless you all. Peace. The first Islamic Film Festival occurs May 3rd through May 4th at the Malcolm X Betty Shabazz Center, 3940 Broadway near 165th Street in Manhattan. For information, 917-940